Hi. Today we're going to be doing chapter 7, but before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and why I decided to do these videos. My name is Carrie, and I wanted to do these videos reading this book, Hinds on High Places, because this has been a lifesaver to me. This is my story, and I am on this journey myself. And as a matter of fact, our chapter 7 today is entitled On the Shores of Loneliness. Today is the 4th of July, and I am alone. In fact, I have been away from my friends and family for over a year and a half now. It has been the fight of my life, but God has been good, and this book has brought me great comfort and joy and peace and hope. And so, though I've read this many, many times in the past, I haven't read it in a while. And so, what I'm also doing with these videos is I do not read ahead. So, today when I read chapter 7, this is going to be the first time I've read it in a long time, probably about 3-4 months. So, I know that will make for mistakes, but it also makes for me to have that raw and real thing for God to speak through me. And for us anyway, because life doesn't come with a false start, and you get to go back and start it over. It just comes, and you got to take it as it comes. And so that's why I wanted to do this, to be on real time. And I just pray that this book blesses you and helps you as much as it has me, because it's been tremendous. She is absolutely me. I also pray that you would forgive the noise. Off to my side is a lake, so sometimes the boats pass by, and so I hope it doesn't leave too much of a distraction. In Jesus' name, let's go ahead and get started with chapter 7. After they walked together through the burning desert sands, then one day, quite unexpectedly, a path crossed the main track which they were following. "This," said the shepherd quietly, "is the path you are now to follow." So they turned westward with the high places right behind their backs and came in a little while to the end of the desert. They found themselves on the shore of a great sea. "It is now time for me to leave you, much afraid," the shepherd said, "and to return to the mountains. Remember, even though you seem to be farther away than ever from the high places and from me, there is really no distance at all separating us. I can cross the desert sands as swiftly as I can leap from the high places down to the valleys. And whenever you call for me, I shall come. This is the word I now leave with you. Believe it and practice it with joy. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Whenever you are willing to obey me, much afraid, and to follow the path of my choice, you will always be able to hear and recognize my voice. And when you hear it, you must always obey. Remember also that it is always safe to obey my voice, even if it seems to call you to paths which look impossible or even crazy." On saying this, he blessed her and went from them, leaping and bounding over the desert toward the high places, which were now actually right behind her. Much afraid, and her 2 companions walked along the shores of the great sea for many days. And at first it seemed to her that up till then she had never known real loneliness. The green valley, where all her friends and she had lived, was far away behind her. Even the mountains were out of sight, and there seemed to be nothing in the whole wide world but endless sandy desert on one side, and the endless sea moaning drearily on the other. Isn't that funny? Land and sea. Told you. Water. Nothing grew there. That's so crazy. That's so crazy. Neither tree nor shrub, nor even grass, but the shores were scattered with broken driftwood, great tangled masses of brown, shriveled seaweed. Nothing lived in the whole region save the seagulls wheeling and crying overhead and the crabs scuttling across the sand into their burrows. At intervals, too, an icy wind came shrilling across the billows, stabbing like a knife. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her two companions, and it was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. Stranger still, perhaps, was the way in which Much Afraid walked, swifter and more upright than ever before, and with scarcely a limp, for something had happened in the wilderness which had left a mark upon her for the rest of her life. It was an inner and secret mark, and no one would have noticed any difference outwardly, but all the same, a deep inner change had taken place, in which indicated a new stage in her life. She had been down to Egypt, and had looked upon the grinding stones, the wheel, the furnace, and knew they symbolized an experience which she herself must go through. Somehow, incredible as it was, she, Much Afraid, had been enabled to accept this knowledge and to acquiesce in it. She knew within herself that with that acceptance, a gulf had opened between herself and her past life, even between her and her past self, a gulf which could never again be closed. She could look back across it to the green valley between the mountains and see herself there with the shepherd's workers feeding her little flock, cringing before her relatives, going to the pool morning and evening to keep tryst with the shepherd. But it was like looking at somebody else different altogether. And she said to herself, I was that woman, but I'm not that woman now. And she didn't understand how it happened, but what the shepherd had said had come to pass in herself. For those who go down into the furnace of Egypt and find there the flower of acceptance come up changed and stamped with royalty upon them. It is true that Much Afraid did not feel at all royal, certainly did not as yet look it. Nevertheless, she had been stamped with the mark and would never be the same again. Therefore, though she went with sorrow and suffering day after day along the shores of great loneliness, she didn't go cringingly or complainingly. Indeed, gradually, an impossible thing seemed to be happening. A new kind of joy was springing up in her heart, and she began to find herself noticing beauties in the landscape of which until then she had been quite unconscious. Her heart often thrilled with an inner ecstasy when she caught sight of the sun shining on the wings of the wheeling seagulls, making them gleam as dazzling white as the snow on the peaks of the far-off high places. Even their wild, mournful cries and the moanings of the water stirred in her a sorrow that was strangely beautiful. She had the feeling that somehow, in the very far-off places, perhaps even in far-off ages, there would be a meaning found to all sorrow and an answer too fair and wonderful as yet to be understood. Often, too, she found herself laughing aloud as she watched the antics of the funny little scuttling crabs. When the sun shone brightly, as it did at times, even the gray, dreary sea was transformed into a thing of surpassing beauty. When the light gleaming on the curving green breakers and the foaming spray and the horizon blue as a midnight sky. When the sun thus shone on the wide wastes of water, it seemed as though all their sorrows were swallowed up in joy. And when she would whisper to herself what he had said, when he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. One day they came to a place on the shore where the high cliffs and great rocks scattered all about. In this place they were to rest for a while, and there, Much Afraid, wandered off by herself. After climbing the cliff, she found herself looking down into a lonely little cove, completely enclosed on 3 sides by the cliffs, and with nothing in it but driftwood and stranded seaweed. The chief impression it had made upon her was its emptiness. It seemed to lie there like an empty heart, watching and longing for that far-off tide, which had receded to such a distance that it could never again return. When, however, drawn by an urge to revisit the lonely cove, Much Afraid went back to the same spot some hours later, all was changed. The waves were now rushing forward with the strength of a high tide urging them onward. Looking over the edge of the cliff, she saw that the cove, which had been so empty, was now filled to the brim. Great waves, roaring and laughing together, were pouring themselves through the sides, through the narrow inlet, and leaping against the sides, irresistibly taking possession of every empty niche and crevice. On seeing this transformation, she knelt down on the edge of the cliff and built her third altar. "O my Lord," she cried, "I thank thee for leading me here. Behold me, here I am, empty as this little cove, but waiting thy time to be filled to the brim with a flood tide of love." Then she picked up a little piece of quartz and crystal which was laying on the rocky cliff and dropped it beside the other memorial stones in the little bag that she carried with her. It was only a short time after the building of that new altar that her enemies were all upon her again. Far away in the valley of humiliation, her relatives had been awaiting the return of Pride with his victim, but as time passed and he didn't return, and Much Afraid did not reappear, it was obvious that he was unsuccessful in his undertaking and too proud to admit it. They decided that reinforcements must be sent as soon as possible, before Much Afraid could reach the high places and be altogether beyond their reach. Spies were sent out who met Pride and brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere on the mountains, but instead far away on the shores of the Sea of Loneliness. She was going in a quite different direction from the mountains altogether. This was unexpectedly delightful and encouraging news, and quickly suggested to them the best reinforcements to be sent to the help of Pride. There was complete unity in deciding that resentment, bitterness, and self-pity should hurry off at once to assist in bringing back Much Afraid to her eagerly awaiting relatives. Off they went to the shores of loneliness, and Much Afraid now had to endure a time of really dreadful assaults. It is true that her enemies soon discovered this was not the same Much Afraid that they had to deal with. They could never get within close reach because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering and accepted their assistance so much more willingly than ever before. However, they kept appearing before her, shouting out their horrid suggestions and mocking her until it really seemed that whenever she went one way or another, then another one popped up. There were so many hiding places for them along the rocks, and they would hurl their darts at her. "I told you so," Pride said viciously. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Not much. Do you know that everyone in the Valley of Humiliation knows about this and is laughing at you? Seeking your heart's desire, hey? And he abandoned you, didn't he? Just like I told you, on the shores of loneliness. Why didn't you listen to me, you little fool?" Then resentment would raise up his head over another rock. He was extremely ugly to look at, but he was horribly fascinating in his ugliness. Sometimes Much Afraid could hardly turn her eyes away when he started at her boldly and shouted, "You know, Much Afraid, you act like a blind idiot. Who is this shepherd you follow? What sort of person is he to demand everything you have, take everything you offer, and give you nothing in return but suffering and sorrow, ridicule and shame? Why do you let him treat you this way? Stand up for yourself and demand he fill his promise at once and take you to the high places. If not, tell him that you feel absolved from all necessity to follow him anymore. Bitterness would then break in with his sneering voice. The more you yield to him, the more he will demand from you. He is cruel to you, takes advantage of your devotion. All he has demanded from you so far is nothing to what he will demand if you persist in following him. He lets his followers, yes, even women and children, go to concentration camps, torture chambers, and hideous deaths of all kinds. Could you bear that, you little whiner? Then you'd be better off to pull out now and leave him before he demands the uttermost sacrifice of all. Sooner or later, he'll put you on a cross of some sort and abandon you to it. Self-pity would chime in next, and in some dreadful way, he was almost worse than any of the others. He talked so softly, in such a pitying tone that Much Afraid would feel weak all over. Poor little Much Afraid, he would whisper. It's too bad, you know. You really are so devoted. You have refused him nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet this is the cruel way that he treats you. Can you really believe when he acts towards you like this that he loves you and has your real good at heart? How can that be possible? You have every right to feel sorry for yourself, even if you are perfectly willing to suffer for his sake. At least other people ought to know about it and pity you instead of misunderstanding and ridiculing as they do. It really seems as though the one you follow takes delight in making you suffer and leaving you to be misunderstood. Every time you yield to him, he thinks of some new way to wound you and bruise you. That last remark of self-pity's was his worst mistake. The word bruising stuck in her mind and reminded Much Afraid of what the shepherd had said when they stood together on the threshing floor in the pyramid. Bread corn is bruised, he had told her, but no one threshes it forever. Only till it's ready to be made bread for others. This also cometh forth from the Lord of hosts, who is wonderful in counsel, excellent in working. Isaiah 28 and 29. When she thought of this, to self-pity's dismayed astonishment, Much Afraid actually picked up a piece of rock and hurled it at him. And as he said afterwards to the other three in a grieved tone of voice, if I hadn't ducked and bolted like a hare, it could have laid me out altogether, the little vixen. But it is exhausting to be assaulted day after day with suggestions like these. And while sorrow and suffering were holding her hands, naturally Much Afraid could not cover her ears, so her enemies were really able to give her a dreadful time. And at last, things came to a crisis. One day, when her companions actually seemed to be sleeping for a little while, Much Afraid unwarily wandered off alone. Not this time to her favorite spot looking down into the little cove, but a new direction, and she came to a place where the cliffs jutted out into the sea, forming a very narrow peninsula which ended in sheer precipice. When she reached the end of this, she stood looking out over the endless expanse of sea and suddenly found, to her horror, all four of her enemies approaching and closing in on her. That already she was becoming a different person was then quite apparent, because instead of nearly fainting for fright at their approach, although she did look very pale and frightened, she actually grabbed a stone in each hand, put her back against a great rock, and prepared to resist them to the limit of her strength. Fortunately, the place was too narrow for all four of them to approach her at once, but Pride put himself in front of the others and stepped toward her, holding fast. You can put down those stones, Much Afraid, he said savagely. There are four of us here, and we mean to do with you as we please, now that you're in our power. You shall not only listen to us, you shall go with us. Much Afraid lifted her face toward the seemingly empty sky, and with all her strength called out, Come to my deliverance, and make no tarrying, O my Lord. To the horror of the four ruffians, there was the shepherd himself leaping toward them along the narrow way, more terrible than a great mountain stag with thrusting horns. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity managed to hurl themselves flat on the ground and edge away as he bounded toward the place where Pride was just seizing hold of Much Afraid. Catching him by the shoulders, the shepherd spun him around, lifted him up in the air where he uttered a loud, despairing shriek, and then dropped him over the edge of the cliff into the sea. "Oh, shepherd!" gasped Much Afraid, shaking with relief and hope. "Thank you. Do you think Pride is really dead at last?" "No," said the shepherd. "It is most unlikely." He glanced over the cliff as he spoke and caught sight of Pride swimming like a fish toward the shore and added, "There he goes. He has had a fall today that he will not forget, and I fancy he will limp for some time to come. As for the other three, they have made off into some hiding place and are not likely to trouble you again in the same way now that they realize I am within call." "Shepherd," asked Much Afraid earnestly, "tell me why I nearly got into Pride's clutches again. Why resentment, bitterness, and self-pity have been able to pester me for so long in such this dreadful way. I did not call you before because they never dared to come close to me or even make a real attack, but they have been lurking around all the time, making horrible suggestions, and I couldn't get away from them. What was it?" "I think," said the shepherd gently, "that lately the way has seemed a little bit easier, and the sun shone, and you came to a place where you could rest, and you forgot for a while that you were my little handmaiden. Acceptance with joy, and were beginning to tell yourself it really was time that I led you back to the mountains and up to the high places. When you wear the weed of impatience in your heart instead of the flower acceptance with joy, you will always find your enemies get an advantage over you." Much Afraid blushed. She knew how right he was in his diagnosis. It had been easier to accept the hard path, to be patient when the sea was gray and dull, than now when the sun shone and everything else looked bright and happy and satisfied. She put her hand in the shepherd's and said sorrowfully, "You are quite right. I've been thinking that you are allowing me to follow this path too long, and you are forgetting your promise." And then she added, looking steadfastly into his face, "But I do tell you now with all my heart that you are my shepherd, whose voice I love to hear and obey, and it is my joy to follow you. You choose, my Lord, and I will obey." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone which was lying beside her feet and said smilingly, "Put this in your bag with the other stones as a memorial of this day when for the first time you saw Pride toppled over before you, and of your promise that you will wait patiently until I give you your heart's desire." And that is chapter 7. Have a great day.